From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report in Special English. The International Monetary Fund says worldwide growth is weaker than expected because of economic concerns in Europe and the United States. But there is some positive news. The number of cars being made is on the rise. That is a sign that the world's economy is moving in the right direction. Measuring economic progress, especially for groups like the middle class, is not easy. But a little-known economic indicator is beginning to gain acceptance. The so-called CAR Index is an attempt to measure the world's middle class based on the number of people who own cars. Experts say that the number of people who own cars in the developing world is rapidly increasing. That is because there are about 70 countries with a population of about 3 billion people who are quickly approaching an important income level, $4,000 per person. Experts say when that level is reached, a country's middle class increases very quickly. This rise in average income means greater demand for goods that are considered non-essential. And many of these goods are produced in Japan, Germany, and the United States. The International Monetary Fund says consumer spending in developed nations has fallen since the economic downturn of 2008. The fund's managing director, Christine Lagarde, points to the debt crisis in Europe and problems in the United States economy as threats to the global economy. Growth could be slower than the IMF had predicted earlier in the year. On the other hand, recent studies show consumer spending in developing countries has increased 3 times faster than in developed economies. For VOA Learning English, I'm Carolyn Presutti. From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. The Chinese meat processing company Shuanghui International is proposing to buy the American ham and pork producer Smithfield Foods. It would be the biggest purchase of an American company by a Chinese buyer. Ham and pork are the meat of pigs. Virginia ham is famous around the world. The town of Smithfield, Virginia, where the company started, calls itself the ham capital of the world. Larry Sancher is the sales manager for Smithfield Foods. He says the explorer Marco Polo brought a basis for curing ham to Italy from China. He says this kind of cured ham turned out to be the prosciutto that we know today. Later, settlers brought the formula for making prosciutto with them to the United States. He says the main reason Smithfield became the center of ham processing was because local Native Americans had methods for producing salt from nearby ocean water. Virginia Wade manages a store that specializes in ham made in Smithfield. She says the ham is aged at least 6 months in salt. She says the uncooked hams are similar to ham in China. Before Smithfield Foods can be sold to the Chinese company, the purchase must be approved by the American government and by Smithfield Foods stockholders. There have been concerns in the past about some Chinese companies doing business in the United States. But Gary Hofbauer expects the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States to approve this purchase. He is with the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington. Mr. Hofbauer believes the Chinese company is buying the world's good opinion of Smithfield Foods, including the quality and safety of its products. For VOA Learning English, I'm Carolyn Presutti.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. A new report says China's demand for food imports will sharply rise in the next 10 years. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development made the prediction. They say China will increase its imports of grains, oilseeds, and meat. Angel Gurria is Secretary General of the OECD. He says China's need for food is growing at a time when world food production is decreasing. Imports to China are expected to grow at a yearly rate of 3% to 1.7 million tons by the year 2022. China's imports of crops used to feed animals, called coarse grains, are expected to double by 2022, and imports of oilseeds are predicted to rise 41%. Angel Gurria says China's economic growth is fueling its hunger for imports. He says the country already has a big effect on world food markets. José Graziano da Silva is the head of the Food and Agriculture Organization. He says reducing the large amount of food that is now wasted would help meet the growing demand for food. The rise in the Chinese demand for food is expected to cause grain and other commodity prices to rise. Businesses are taking new steps because of China's influence on world food trade. Last month, the Chinese meat processing company Shuanghui announced a $7 billion offer for the American pork company Smithfield Foods. China is already the world's biggest importer of milk and soybeans. It is expected to become the world's biggest consumer of pork, passing the European Union within 10 years. The FAO and OECD say that will cause international pork prices to rise. For VOA Learning English, I'm Alex Villarreal. I'm Alex Villarreal with the VOA Special English Economics Report. Few people had ever heard of the natural elements known as rare earth metals before a recent dispute between China and Japan. Yet these metals are used in devices like smartphones, flat-screen televisions, hybrid car batteries, MP3 players, and military equipment. In September, Japan detained a Chinese ship captain near disputed islands in the East China Sea. China denied that it stopped exports of rare earth metals to Japan to force his release. But the incident raised concerns. Japan is the world's biggest importer of rare earth metals, and China produces 97% of the world's supply. China says it sold almost $4 billion worth in 2008. But marketing professor George Haley at the University of New Haven in Connecticut says China has always kept prices low. He says, so unlike other minerals, the price of rare earth elements has actually fallen. Some countries with rare earth metals no longer mine them, including the United States. One reason is the low-cost imports from China. Another reason is concern about environmental damage. So, what are these rare earth metals? Well, most of them are not rare. That is just their name. Several are more common than copper, lead, or silver. People who remember the periodic table of the elements from chemistry class might recognize them. Rare earths include the 15 lanthanide metals, along with yttrium and scandium. Samuel Bader, a physicist at the Argonne National Laboratory near Chicago, says rare earths are often found together. But Mr. Bader explains that the same properties that make them hard to refine also make them valuable. He says rare earth metals provide the world's strongest commercial magnets. This is why they're important. It's that simple. Rare earth magnets are lightweight and unaffected by conditions like high temperatures. So they work well in places like electric motors in hybrid vehicles or generators for wind turbines. Physicists use super powerful magnets to speed particles and control radiation, like X-rays. George Haley says they are found in electronics, fiber optics, and other products. They are important not just for the economic success of the United States, but for defense and job creation at home. Next week, we'll talk more about rare earth metals and an American company that plans to start mining them again. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. From VOA Learning English, welcome to the Economics Report in Special English. China has been struggling to deal with record levels of smog over Beijing. Recently, officials in several Chinese cities announced plans to trade carbon credits as a way to reduce air pollution. For many years, China considered economic growth more important than the environment. The nation remains hungry for energy, but it has also become the world's biggest producer of carbon gases. Beijing's smoggy days have made international news. Small particles in the air reduce visibility and threaten public health. Smog has been a concern in the city for years, but a sharp rise in pollution levels in January led to sharp criticism from many Chinese. Pollution from coal-burning power centers and factories is a big part of the problem. Now, officials hope to control industrial air pollution by creating systems to trade carbon credits. The trading systems or platforms would enable companies to receive credits for lowering greenhouse gas emissions. The credits can then be traded. The goal of these market-based platforms is to get businesses to invest in clean technology. Markets for carbon credits are expected to open this year in 7 cities, including Beijing, Shanghai, and Tianjin. Officials say the government has decided to start with pilot programs because carbon trading is something new. China wants to launch a national carbon trading program by 2016. Still, public pressure continues building on the government to find an answer to thick air pollution. Wu Changhua is with the Climate Group. She says the Chinese people are looking at more than jobs. They want a better environment, too. For VOA Learning English, I'm Alex Villarreal.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. Investors in the United States are preparing for the first public sale of stock in the Chinese company Alibaba. The company sells goods by linking buyers and sellers in the huge Chinese online market. Alibaba is expected to make its initial public offering, called an IPO, in September on the New York Stock Exchange. The total value of the company, based in Hangzhou, has been estimated at about $200 billion. Reports from Bloomberg News say Alibaba is offering investors a 12% share of the company. That would mean the company could raise more than $20 billion in the public stock sale. After the IPO, Alibaba could become one of the most valuable technology companies in the world. The e-commerce company is responsible for most online sales in China. It dealt with more exchanges last year than U.S. companies Amazon and eBay combined. And it has more than 230 million active buyers. Scott Kennedy is director of Indiana University's Research Center for Chinese Politics and Business. He says Alibaba has grown from a very small company 15 years ago to the main online seller in China. The company holds about 80% of the Chinese online sales market. Scott Kennedy says the company is profitable, which is unusual for a technology company first offering an IPO. Alibaba has chosen to sell its stock to the public on the New York Stock Exchange rather than in China. China is now the world's second largest market for e-commerce. For VOA Learning English, I'm Carolyn Presutti.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. Recent Chinese trade information shows that China's exports to North Korea decreased by more than 13% during the first 6 months of 2013. This is the first time in 4 years that exports have fallen. Exports decreased by about $1.6 billion from January to June compared to the same period last year. The last time exports from China to North Korea dropped was in 2009 during the world financial crisis. This year, there was a large decrease in shipments of unprocessed oil to North Korea. Lu Chao studies at the Liaoning Academy of Social Sciences. He says China is the biggest oil provider to North Korea. He said last year, China exported 500,000 tons of oil to the country. Mr. Liu says China placed trade restrictions on North Korea this year after its third nuclear test. He says the Chinese government made the decision based on a United Nations Security Council resolution. North Korea's decision to carry out its third nuclear test earlier this year has affected ties between the two countries. Following the test, Chinese students called on the government to completely cut ties with North Korea. Chinese officials have condemned the test. They have called for the continuation of six-nation talks aimed at ending the country's nuclear weapons programs. In May, the government-operated People's Bank of China announced it was no longer doing business with North Korea's Foreign Trade Bank. Recently, officials from the United States and South Korea met. They announced their plan to continue placing restrictions on North Korea and to seek more assistance from China in the process. For VOA Learning English, I'm Alex Villarreal.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. The number of people visiting South Africa grew by almost 10% last year. One country making that number grow is China. Chinese investment has been increasing in South Africa. So has the number of Chinese visitors to the country. China sends the fourth largest number of tourists to South Africa. More than 130,000 Chinese tourists went there last year. Europeans remain the biggest tourism group, but the percentage of Chinese tourists grew by 56% from 2011 to 2012. Beverly Schaefer is a member of Cape Town city government. She represents an area that is home to a famous soccer stadium. She says the number of visitors to the country increased after South Africa hosted the World Cup Soccer Championship in 2010. South Africa's travel industry has been noting the growing number of Chinese tourists. Mariette Dutoit-Helmbold has worked with Cape Town Tourism. She says the industry is looking for Chinese-speaking guides and has started providing information in Mandarin Chinese. There are several reasons for the increase in Chinese tourists. One could be South Africa's inclusion in the BRICS economic group, which also includes China. Also, South Africa recently added visa application centers in Beijing and Shanghai. And last year, South African Airways added direct flights between Beijing and Johannesburg. Traditionally, Cape Town's tourism industry has been directed toward Europeans and Americans, who often travel in smaller groups or as couples. However, Chinese tourists often prefer to travel in larger groups. For VOA Learning English, I'm Mario Ritter.
This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. Commodities are basic materials that are used and traded worldwide. The price of commodities helps determine how much a business can charge for a product and the profit it can make. Commodity prices have reached a 2-year high since falling sharply during the world financial crisis. Hard commodities are materials like iron ore, oil, and gold. Agricultural products are soft commodities. These include wheat, cotton, and rice. Economic measures show the world economy is recovering unevenly. China and India, for example, have reported strong growth in manufacturing. Developed nations have had slower growth. John James is a business professor at Pace University in New York State. He says demand in developing economies can push up prices for commodities like oil and iron ore used for making steel. But, he says, changing currency values can also influence prices. He says the increase in the price of commodities is a reflection of the instability of both the euro and the dollar. The best example of that is gold. Gold prices have reached record levels in recent months. That means gold dealers must pay more for the commodity now than they did only a year ago. That affects current prices. Not surprisingly, manufacturers want some control over the prices they pay for commodities. Futures contracts are agreements between a buyer and a seller to exchange something at a set price at some time in the future. These contracts let buyers lock in a price for basic materials. But some traders in futures markets only want to make a profit. They buy or sell contracts depending on the direction they believe prices will go. These speculators get blamed when prices rise or fall too quickly. The United States, Germany, and France are looking into ways to limit this kind of trading. Some experts say exporting commodities is not a good path to long-term economic growth. The United Nations recently reported that the least developed countries must change their economies to provide good incomes for their citizens. Supachai Panichpakdi leads the UN development group UNCTAD. He says the least developed countries need to cut dependence on commodities and manufacture products for export. He says only this will let them gain from world trade. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. Many Pakistanis are increasingly concerned about their economy. Safar Saeed directs an occupational training center in Islamabad, the capital. For the past 10 years, the center has trained thousands of people for work in an increasingly difficult economy. Now, the business is struggling with issues ranging from loss of electricity to inflation. Safar Saeed blames the government for the situation. He says his organization has suffered big financial losses in the last 5 years. One of the reasons is long power outages. Another reason is that inflation makes it hard for people to pay his fees, so they can learn skills that lead to income. Other people share his opinion. Street protests against power outages are common in Pakistan. Some outages can now last an entire day. Ashfaq Hassan Khan is a professor at the Nust Business School in Islamabad. He says there has been too little political will to fix the national tax system. Less than 1% of Pakistan's 180 million people pay income taxes. About 70% of federal lawmakers did not complete any income tax documents last year. As Professor Khan notes, that makes it more difficult to ask major donors to the country for help. He says other nations question why they should provide Pakistan with aid when Pakistan does not tax its own wealthy citizens. 60% of the Pakistani population is under the age of 25. Opinion surveys show that young people are most concerned about economic problems and corruption. For VOA Learning English, I'm Laurel Bowman. You can watch more caption videos at the VOA Learning English website and the VOA Learning English channel on YouTube.